Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Katerina for inviting me to take part in this conference and to be speaking today. With Ukraine's cultural heritage under daily attack, the challenges for Ukraine's conservators and restorers have never been greater. As a conservator myself, with decades of treatment experience and years of conservation training and teaching experience in Ukraine, I'd like to share with you some of my impressions of the current state of conservation in Ukraine and offer suggestions for the future. Ukrainian conservators exhibit remarkable manual skills, as evidenced here, with young students executing perfect copies in oil and tempera, or manually exploring the various layers on a painting to determine its paint history. And yet conservation, as practiced today in the West, encompasses much broader expectations, focusing on much more than the actual treatment of objects. I suggest 3 areas of growth that would greatly enhance conservation in Ukraine. The first is networking within the profession and beyond. The second is updating the curricula of the conservation training programs. And the third is to introduce important areas of competence as necessary skills for all conservators, including preventive conservation and conservation science. The following remarks will focus on these areas of expertise. Until the last number of years, very few Ukrainian conservators interacted with conservators in the West, primarily due to the English language barrier, which resulted in their not assimilating the innovations and the conservation knowledge beyond their own community. Today, various Ukrainian conservators are displaced in other countries due to the war, and in doing so are being exposed to very different conservation approaches. A handful of others, before the war, took advantage of Western approaches by voluntarily studying abroad. Today, these conservators are building on their experiences by forming their own non-governmental professional conservation organization. These factors and others are opening the door to an exchange of knowledge and expertise with international conservation organizations, such as the International Institute for Conservation, acronym IIC, or the American Institute for Conservation, or ECHO, the European Confederation of Conservator Restorers Organizations. These 3 organizations are examples of professional networks and are sensitive to the needs of conservators in Ukraine. The second area of growth is the training of future and current Ukrainian conservators. Conservation students at the training academies and university programs can build on their already acquired strengths by deepening the knowledge in areas so far underrepresented in their curriculum. This image depicts my teaching of microscopic wood identification to the students of the Lviv Polytechnic National University in a subject that was unknown to them, as an example of experts visiting Ukraine to teach within an established university or academy program. The image on the right depicts a Ukrainian mid-career conservator taking part in an IIC-sponsored specialized training program in Beijing and Japan as an example of lifelong learning. IIC has agreed in principle to create a training center in Ukraine should the funding become available. These 2 images highlight the separate but effective approaches that would be necessary to address the needs of 2 different groups of individuals, namely students in their graduate training as well as already practicing professionals. Such a 2-pronged approach would greatly accelerate the preservation of Ukraine's cultural heritage. Ukrainian conservators should acquire the core competencies that are common to conservators in the West to address the full spectrum of cultural historic preservation. A list of such competencies has been compiled, for example, by the American Institute for Conservation, such as conservation terminology, conservation history, ethics, philosophy, values and significance, history of technology of cultural heritage, access and use of cultural heritage, health and safety policies and regulations, scientific principles and methods, processes of deterioration and change, preventive care, examination methods, documentation, and treatment methods. These competencies rely on having access to up-to-date conservation resources. To address the lack of such resources in Ukrainian, my translation of the award-winning book, The Conservation of Medieval Polychrome Wood Sculpture, is in the final editing stages and is slated for presentation at the Lviv Book Forum in September of this year, with the publisher being Rodovid. It will greatly enhance the preservation of Ukraine's icons, iconostases, and polychrome sculptures. The center book, An Introduction to Materials and Chemistry for Conservators, is in the negotiating process with the publisher for a Ukrainian language version. The book on the right, Preventive Conservation, Collection Storage, is a text I recommend for translation since it offers a wealth of knowledge and introduces the third topic, one that is currently not covered in conservation education in Ukraine, preventive conservation. Unlike the treatment of individual objects, preventive conservation focuses on the treatment of groups of objects and includes the measures for their preservation of collections as a whole. Possible actions include the survey of environmental conditions for their long-term care, whether they be in a museum, a storage facility, or an open-air work of art such as a period Ukrainian wooden church. This fundamentally important subject should be a required topic for all conservation specialties and needs to be a new focus in training of conservators in Ukraine. This image depicts a temperature and relative humidity data logger and related graph that is a necessary tool to monitor environmental conditions. This instrumentation should be in every Ukrainian museum and storage facility. Preventive conservation also addresses the best practices for handling and maintenance procedures for packing, transport, exhibition, and storage of works of art, a subject that all Ukrainian museum directors have first-hand knowledge due to the war. It also encompasses an integrated approach to pest management, the body of knowledge addressing museum pests such as insects. In this photograph of the Olesko repository several years ago, which by the way holds over 1,200 Renaissance and Baroque polychrome sculptures, I was informed that the insect problem was being addressed with the use of poisonous chemicals. There are better approaches today. Lastly, preventive conservation addresses emergency preparedness and response, such as these very special water mist fire extinguishers, which were donated by international conservation agencies to be placed in Ukraine's wooden churches in the case of a fire hazard. Ukrainian heritage is little known outside of Ukraine, and the technical knowledge of Ukraine's cultural artifacts even less so, with very little published in English. Other than the language barrier, one practical reason for this situation is the lack of up-to-date equipment to support the technical art history and detailed examination. This contemporary image depicts a Soviet-era microscope circa 1962, currently in use in the conservation laboratory of the Andrei Sheptytsky National Museum in Lviv. To advance research and interpretation of cultural artifacts, I suggest the creation of a regional art conservation lab in this museum facility with contemporary instrumentation and the nurturing of conservation science and scientists in Ukraine. This will allow more detailed and informed decisions on conservation treatments, and especially the authentication process, now more likely necessary due to the war. A welcome addition would be a mobile art conservation lab, a prominent example being Hyperion HS, designed to research cultural heritage objects on site, avoiding the necessity of packing and transport to a stationary lab. Training conservators with a focus on these neglected competencies, such as preventive conservation, providing them access to resources published in other languages, and new instrumentation, creating a network of Ukrainian conservators within an international organization, promoting the successful collaboration of conservators with art historians and scientists, these suggestions explained in my talk will support the effective treatment and advance the preservation, interpretation, and preservation of Ukraine's heritage. Thank you for following my vision of new responsibilities for Ukrainian museums, which I strongly believe will take us from the crisis we are all witnessing today to the future. I'd like to thank Dr. Hanela Romich, Hagop Kevorkian, Professor Emerita of Conservation at the New York University's Institute of Fine Arts, for her assistance in helping me with this presentation. Дякую за увагу.